Welcome to SpringFest, April 5th, 2018. This seminar is about universal design and what property managers and owners need to know. It is my pleasure to partner in this seminar with Jane Sleeth, co-founder of Optimum Performance Incorporated, who is passionate about accessibility and universal design as I am. Our presentation will shed light on the challenges and opportunities of achieving an accessible environment in public spaces and the work and home settings. My name is Cynthia Henderson, and I am a co-founder of my business, which is an architecture and interior design business, Culver and Henderson Building Design. And we've done many, many projects over the last 15 years of making buildings accessible, new and renovated. Jane Sleeth is she's a physiotherapist, and she runs a business called Optimal Performance Inc. And Jane is well known for delivering training sessions to all kinds of companies, whether they be industrial like Chrysler or banks, to enable them to go through this path of how to make all spaces accessible and universal. So what are the definitions between universal design? What are these words, universal design or inclusive design? What is accessible design? What is barrier-free design? I'm just going to simply put just a couple of words to these definitions. Universal design or inclusive design is really meant for design to be accessible for everyone of all ages, of all capabilities, and with all equipment. You know, mothers with strollers, they need accessible design. People who have just had an accident or on crutches, they need accessible design. But that would mean that it's all inclusive for everybody of all ages and capabilities. Accessible design is really designed for specific needs. So we'll say, well, what does a specific need mean? Well, it means that a corridor has to be like 4 feet in an office tower for accessible design hallways. And there's specific things about accessibility that provide those dimensions, and they do make sense. So everybody's able to use it. For example, people who may be in a wheelchair, they need a turning radius of 5 feet minimum. So those kinds of things are making accessible design for people who need that. The barrier-free design is really related to the Ontario Building Code or the National Building Code or any jurisdiction's building code. And it enables all designers, architects, interior designers, builders, Optimum Performance Incorporated designers, to look at the specifics for every area in a building or outside for public spaces. How should the codes read? How should they be implemented for building permit? So those are the differences that we need to know. Today we're going to do our seminar in a couple of ways. One, we're going to do a format which is just introducing 3 scenarios of landlords and tenants and people in the business of building. And we're going to go through 3 scenarios, and after that we're going to go through some slides and some examples of all the things to do with universal design. So we'll start out with this first scenario. I will be the landlord and Jane will be the tenant. So this first scenario is where a large real estate company is dealing as a bank, and they're dealing with a bank tenant. So the building is a 40-year-old building and it's 30 stories.
And in our case, what we're actually needing is we want to move in within the next year. We've got 100 employees per each of the floors. We'll need 3 floors, 10,000 square feet, because we're a growing bank. And we're moving into, it's a 40-year-old building. And so what we want to know is, are there going to be accessible washrooms? And if so, how many?
Well, there is 1 accessible washroom per floor. That means there are, in this 30-floor building, there are 3 accessible washrooms. Is that going to be okay for you?
So our question will be, especially with the banking industry, is we need to actually have more washrooms. We need to make sure that they're all accessible.
Okay. So as a landlord, and I want you as a tenant, because I understand there's many employees, maybe thousands, and you could have this space for over 5 years, probably 10 at the minimum. I want to keep you. So I'll say to you that I am going to confirm in our lease allowance that construction will allow 1 accessible washroom per floor. That's 3 washrooms for your 3 floors of 10,000 square feet for your 100 employees.
So that's going to meet the standards that we have internally with the bank.
Okay, good. We like to meet standards. We like to be on the chart for standards. Okay, the second scenario is the landlord and a project manager of a real estate company. The building is a 20-year-old suburban building with 5 floors and on-grade parking. The lease is for 5 years.
So what we're going to require is 5,000 square feet. We need accessible washrooms, 20 spaces for parking, and we need at least 2 barrier-free parking spaces.
Okay, I don't have any problem at all building an accessible washroom on the 1 floor for you. That's not a problem. And we can certainly provide the 2 barrier-free spaces. We'll have to obviously juggle around some of the parking that we have to date to do that, but I think that's all very doable.
And what we need to know is how the lease costs and construction work are going to work out.
The lease cost will be worked out in the construction cost because we want to make sure that you're a happy tenant and we want to keep you here. Okay, the third scenario is we're looking at a professional expert. That would be someone like Jane, Optimum Performance Inc., or an architect or an interior designer, and the landlord. The space is a suburban mall, like Yorkdale. There's a new retail space, 3,000 square feet, to be built for 15 people, and they move in 6 months with a 5-year lease.
So the designs are done for the client, and we require a barrier-free washroom. We want to make sure it's planned and built, and then the counters are all going to be at the correct height.
Okay, that should be allowable in our construction costs. We know that having a barrier-free washroom is going to help your employees, and we're aiming to keep a good retail space going for many more years than just 5. So we look forward to your move.
And the other question that we have is our staff are going to use public transportation. We want to make sure that that's actually that there's things in place relative to being able to get our staff and also even our customers to the space.
Right. Well, there is good transportation to Yorkdale at the moment, and it's always been a really efficient way to get there. Parking is there, but I say take your life in your own hands when you park at Yorkdale. We know that's not exactly what you do if you can take the subway. The subway's very accessible.
That's true.
So does anyone have any questions after this segment? And if you do, we can answer them, and then we'll go through the slides of the specifics about the nature of universal design. Oh, yes? Well, it's a very good point. They do, but they might, when you say, do they need them? Yes, they do need them, but are they existing? No. In a new build, they will be planned. In an existing building, they probably don't have them. So there's all these questions about when a person goes into a space, it's going to be renovated. So they ask for them, and that makes sense. And it's required by the codes. The Ontario Building Code does require accessibility washrooms. About the number of floors and all that, that's not right now to be determined, but that's what we understand happens when tenants go and talk to PMs or landlords. I need accessible washrooms on my floor. Why do I have to go up 10 floors? And that is a fact that's happening in downtown Toronto. Partly because we have very old building stock and it's not all renovated. Now we have new building stock, which of course is going to be very well done and very good, but it's going to be a lot more expensive too. But I don't know what the tenants' pressures are about moving, or if they're ready to move into a new building, or they want to stay in the old building, but these are important factors. And the reason that we're introducing these scenarios is because you're all in the business, your PMs, your landlords, your builders, you understand, you know, what is at stake with this important issue. There's a lot of things at stake, and we'll get into that right now. Any other questions? It's that's exactly required, of course, but it doesn't become what's $1,000 or something. It's not a really big deal. What the point is that you need that in order to have the accessibility to all, not only washrooms. It's all within a floor that has to have door operators and push buttons or whatever you want, just to make sure everybody can get in and out very easily. You don't, like, I wouldn't say it's all required, but at least there's dimensions to say you need this space. If you didn't have that door operator, you'd have to have 2 feet or 1 foot going the other way to enable people to use these doors properly. But back to your point, yes, I've done a project. It was quite a nice home for young mothers, and we had to put in 10 of those operators. It was great. They had strollers. They need to get in and out without pushing really heavy doors. And yes, it was expensive, but it was worthwhile. So, you know, all those things are just gradually every building has to undergo renovations for this. Any other questions? Okay, we'll go on to the meat of the matter. Jane.
Okay, so this will actually probably answer your questions in terms of risks, because I think a lot of businesses in Ontario are looking at the end goal, which is we're supposed to be an accessible Ontario by 2025. No one quite knows what that is, and if you ask anyone their definition, no one will be able to provide that. But there's risks that you need to be aware of in not doing this. So more and more tenants are becoming educated about this, particularly if they are a federally regulated tenant, such as banks, Air Canada. So a number of them are federally regulated. They actually are going to come and ask, do you have universally designed washrooms? Do you have the ability to open the doors automatically? Or if you look at the washrooms here where there aren't even doors, where you just have the turns so that there's privacy, but then you don't have to worry about doors, etc. So there's a number of risks. And one thing to be aware of is if you aim for the Ontario Building Code, you will not make your space accessible. It's a bare minimum standard. And when our auditors, and we've got auditors with different types of disabilities, some in wheelchairs, some who are blind, some who are deafened, when they go in and look at that and someone says, look, it meets code, well, they're not able to use it. So it's actually a waste of money just to aim for code. You really need to look at accessible design. So PWD is people with disabilities, just so you're aware. At the end of the day, even if you say it's met code, that will not prevent you from having a human rights complaint go in, especially in condos, for example, where we're starting to see this. Human rights complaints, 55% of all complaints made in Ontario and even federally are related to people with disabilities not being accommodated in their condos, in their homes, in their office towers, in any sort of built environments. So, and that's been growing steadily since the AODA. Although a lot of buildings and building owners are putting off this thing, saying, well, we don't have to do anything till 2025, that's actually incorrect. You want to mitigate risk, but you also want to attract certain tenants into your built environments. And the other is things like social media. If you start to look at a hashtag called #AccessFail, you will start to see very public displays of lack of access. The most recent was David Lepofsky, who is a lawyer who happens to be blind, and he was walking through the new student center at Ryerson. Walks right into a post and can't navigate around the building. And the irony is Ryerson actually has disability management programs, studies, and they also have engineering and universal design experts there. So it's ironic that they're teaching this course and yet they have a building that actually isn't accessible for people. So those sorts of risks are real and present. The topic about universal design, because there's a lot of words that are out there, but as Cynthia was saying at the start, relative to the building code, you're looking at what they'll call it barrier-free design. It's a very limited definition. So you really want to look more at universal design. The whole idea about universal design, it came from University of Northern California, and it's now moved to University in Buffalo. Universal design is critical because you're actually designing, you're not designing for someone with a disability. What you're actually thinking of is a built environment being designed so that everyone, no matter what their abilities or their age, or whether it's a mom with a stroller, whatever it is, that it makes life easier for everyone. So if you actually start from that, and we're working with one of the banks now who's in the middle of building a huge new tower, downtown Toronto, and their goal is not, they don't want to just meet barrier-free, they actually want to meet universal design. So they're starting from that, and we're going to try to aim for that as much as possible.
Now, this is an important slide, and there's a lot of information here, but we'll try and just make it very simple because there's a building code part of this, and there's the AODA, Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act. So, Jane, you can sort of look at the chart, point to it.
So the government, of course, always tries to confuse us with new legislation, especially if they change things around every 5 years. So we're using this chart more so people understand that if you are a business and if you have one employee or more, you need to be in compliance. That's a very unique approach to accessibility. There's no other jurisdiction in the world actually that's doing this. South of the border, they have the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, and they've developed standards over time. It's been around for a long period of time. This has been present in Ontario for 11 years. The uptake rate of people actually being in compliance, businesses, is only about 40%. So when I ask people in a room, how many of you remember taking customer service training and something called IASR training? And it's the usual response we get. So everyone in the room, if you are an employee or you are an employer and you have at least one employee, as of last year, everyone should have received customer service training, and everyone should have actually had training on what's called the IASR, which is the information. It's this here, this whole section, Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation, and there should have been a third part about human rights. So if you haven't done that, and if you have an HR person or someone that's in charge of training in your organization, get them to do that right away, because what's happening is letters are going out to businesses who are not in compliance, and there are penalties starting to be levied for businesses that are not complying. So training is a big part of this. There should be policies internally in your businesses and procedures related to customer service. A lot of businesses decided, they went off and spoke to their lawyers and said, do we need to do this training? And you're talking about half an hour of people's time. And it was about sensitizing people and getting people to understand what the AODA is and why it's important in the province. So they went off to lawyers and said, oh, only your customer-facing employees need to take this. That has now changed as of last year. So this is now folded into the Integrated Accessibility Standards, and everyone has to have this training. So that needed to be both completed by everyone and then reported to the government as of last year. So the Integrated Accessibility Standards includes all your information and communication, which should be in an accessible format if asked. Employment, so your hiring practices, recruiting practices, everything else. And this is the same for your tenants. Your tenants are faced with the same, they need to meet all of this as well, and that's why they're going to start to ask more of you about accessibility. The public space design is also a requirement, and under the IASR. And what that means, it's not just parks and pathways, it's also parking. And it also includes kiosks, and it includes reception desks, and the whole public area, for example, a lobby within the, and I can, will this work out, Gail? Because I can send it to you as well.
Yeah, this is good.
Okay, yeah, this tends to be a helpful slide, so if you want, we can make sure that this is sent to you. So we have public space design, and then we have the building code as well, and the barrier-free design within the building code. Remembering that the building code's barrier-free design is a minimum standard, and it does not provide accessibility. It does in terms of the washrooms, but many of the other aspects are actually overlooked. So just to be aware of that.
We'll move on and we'll do the questions afterwards. So this is a great slide, especially for people who are in businesses and knowing that business costs money when you're not doing the right thing. So this is showing how corporations and individuals will be penalized for non-compliance and contraventions. And it's enforceable. So if you haven't gone on to, if your business does not have accessible plan in place, and it's a plan, you can have a form, you say, I'm doing something within 5 years, I'll do something within 10 years. And that's what Jane's firm does. They present that plan. Then you could be penalized. So from anywhere from minor penalties from $5,000, $2,500 up to major $15,000 to $10,000 for not doing what has to be done. And otherwise, you're going to be faced with human rights lawsuits, as in the States. That seems to be the way. Their mechanism is just go to court, sue. We don't have that problem here. I hope it doesn't become like that. So that's why this is a good thing to follow. And again, it's following through with training is necessary for every business. So once you do your building and everything's properly designed and you feel like everything's in place for universal design, then it's good to have the training people, as Jane's firm will show, how to train people to use the elevator, how to train people to get off the elevator, not go on the elevator during fire drills. And I've done many, building designs where I've done conversions of buildings to put in elevators. And, they need training. I mean, do you think a person who's the head, the president of the association or the company is going to know anything? They're going to say, no, I'm going to give it to HR. Everybody should be trained. Everybody. Because you don't know who's going to be on the floor when there's a fire. You don't know who's going to be needing assistance and not to be, put into a refuge place, for example, near an elevator. There's all those things that need to be done. For some reason, everybody thinks just because the building is done and the building inspector walks away, we're done. There's a lot of things that have to be put into place. This is again about the training and education. Just saying how many people are really, 1 in 4 people now are going to be 65 to 69 years of age and may have a severe disability. And they're not, everybody is severe, but it's just the whole awareness, which is a good idea. And there's a timelines for private organizations. You can speak to that, Jane.
Yeah, so there's the way that the ISR is now set up is that if you have 1 to 49 employees, there's actually a timeline of what needs to be done and when. And I can provide this to you. I've got a few hard copies here, but as back as 2012, this is when you all should have received your customer service training, and that would have been reported through Service Ontario to what's called the Directorate, Accessibility Directorate for Ontario. Policies, you should have policies in place about employment information communication, that there should have been filing that's occurred. And where the penalties are actually occurring so far is that either companies aren't going to Service Ontario and saying whether you're compliant or not, or some companies have actually falsely stated that they are in compliance. And what's happening is the directorate has inspectors and they're actually seeing if companies who said they're in compliance actually are. And that's when financial penalties have been levied from the prior slide. And that can mean over time, once they become stricter with this, that both directors of corporations as well as senior managers would have to pay as individuals as well as the corporation itself. So financial penalties need to be described to your senior managers and executives because they may not be aware of this. It hasn't been really well advertised. Design of public spaces started this year, where if there's any sort of renovation or redevelopment, off-street parking lots need to be accessible with 2 types of spots. So some people that need more room, for example, because they have side entry into their vans, so you need to have a different size parking spot than people that use a regular car, for example. Service counters, fixed queuing guides, waiting areas, all of those need to have accessible elements in it. So these are all the different timelines that have come up. 2021, your websites need to meet something called WCAG 2.0. Sounds very technical, double level A. And if you want to see what that looks like, if you go to any of the banks, in particular IBM, Microsoft, and look at their websites, you'll see what an accessible website actually looks like. And if you want to figure out if your own website, a really basic thing to do is go to your website, don't use your mouse. Do blind people use a mouse to navigate their computers? How do they navigate? Never thought about it. Sound? How do you get the sound? So there should be sound in the website. So the way that people who are blind navigate your websites is they're just using the arrow keys. And when the arrow moves something along, then it should be able to read that out to me so I know what it is. So just try to navigate your website with just your arrow keys and see what happens, just as a very basic example. Yeah.
So we're going to show some images, some good and some poorly designed images of spaces. So this image shows the architecture and design community, facilities management, building owners, etc., have thought that these things were okay to use and left it like this. For example, there's a ramp and a door opens into a little ramp at the stairs. So, people do think that this is acceptable. It doesn't even make sense to us because we're in the community of design, but somehow a building manager or owner thinks that's fine. And then we have a little touch thing here that would be used for a bank or something, but you can't even get your legs underneath that. It's a console, but anyway, that's not well designed. And then you have this funny little icon here, which is very poorly designed as well.
So the CAPTCHA. How many of you gone into CAPTCHA and made at least one mistake when you try to input it?
Many, I'm sure. I mean, there's so many numbers or letters that you can hardly read.
Right. So imagine if you have, even if you wake up first thing in the morning, can't find your glasses, and you're temporarily disabled. So this is a good example of really poor design.
Yeah. And these are examples of fairly good design. I mean, we won't say it's a beautiful design, but it's functional. So you have grab bars in the washroom, you have push buttons in the washrooms, obviously some leg space underneath the vanity, and the faucets are a little bit off the very deep dimension to set a faucet, so at least it's a little bit off to the side. Very interesting notes about maintenance and how buildings just continually leave things in the middle of their walkways and malls, like a sign like this, or in a parking lot, snow is being piled up into a disabled spot, or any spot, but snow being piled up into a parking spot is really quite a key issue. It's affecting visibility, it's affecting movability. These things have to be maintained. How many people have seen these things in offices where you're walking past, there's a trash can right in the middle of the hallway, or signage that's up at 10 foot high, or a plant. I don't know what height that is, but it's probably about 5 foot. So if you're under 5 foot, you're fine. Over, watch out. Accessible design for one type of disability will disable other people at least and create safety risks for most end users. This part, or this stairway, is to the courthouse in Vancouver. It's the Robson Plaza. It's fabulous, but it's very poorly designed because you don't have any railings, and people will definitely trip down those stairs unless you're able-bodied and very conscious of everything you see. And so it's quite interesting how beautiful design could be a bit better. And then functionality, you've got this little ramp here, which we know is a very interesting and good idea, but unfortunately it's blocking other people walking down the sidewalk. So training could have been put together for that company who put out that little ramp, saying, put out the little ramp when you know the person is there ready to accept it, and then bring it in when you know that other people are going to be using the sidewalk. But those are simple little things, but they are constantly just misused. This is persons with disabilities. 7 to 20% of North Americans have difficulty accessing technology, built environments, communications, equipment, processes, increasingly difficult to access with age. So I like this one the best. I think we're in a space which is similar, carpet. So, it's pretty patterned. It's a very hard carpet to say that looks very calm. It's not calm. It's probably just that pattern so it shields dirt. But it's very mixed up pattern. It's very confusing. And then on the right-hand side of this slide is a very good way there's touch pads, and there's ways to talk over the screen, magnetic field from induction loop, aerial. So there's a lot of technology that is actually being invented today, which will be used, and better inventions will be coming out every day, of course. But you can move toward that. Yes?
Just imagine someone that has a seizure disorder. So this was actually put into a banking environment. And it's a bank that regularly works with us in terms of human factors design, accessible design. But quite often the designers forget to come and ask us first. So if I have low vision and I'm walking on this can be very confusing. And for a lot of people with low vision, they can't tell if those are stairs or actually a flat hallway. So if you sort of semi-close your eyes, or if you had sunglasses on to actually mimic low vision, someone may actually start thinking that that's a stairway. So these are no longer part of the standard in this building. Yeah.
It's the ideal carpet.
Well, there's color theory about that, yes, and just too much to get into at the moment. Solid, not exactly, I wouldn't say that's exactly the final result of getting specifying a good carpet, but just not too much pattern that becomes something other than the floor you're walking on is really the key thing, not too much contrast. So it could be, color's one opportunity to look at, but I don't really think we can get into the details of it. But mainly it's dividing it perhaps in sections to show, and that could be a section that's dividing it so that people kind of get a pace of where they're going. It's not like one big flow, they don't know where they're going. There's a lot of theory around just being able to take a flow and not feel too confused.
And one of the things that I talk about, because a lot of architects and interior designers assume that if they worked with us, we're going to make things look really ugly. It'll be really functional, but it won't look very nice. That's absolutely incorrect. You can actually have form and function together. So you could have a carpet that has color, et cetera, corporate colors or whatever it is you're looking at. But the other opportunity is carpeting and floor surfaces can become a method for wayfinding. So if I'm in an airport and I'm in a rush and it's like, I've got to get to Terminal 2 and I'm not sure how, then why not have the floor surface help guide people that are looking around, their first time I've ever been in here, or I have low vision, I'm using a cane. So as you say, there's more complexity to it, but this is a prime example of what not to do. It doesn't help with wayfinding. In fact, some of the people with low vision that worked on this floor were walking into the glass wall at the end because they thought this was walking them in the right direction. You had a question here?
No, actually, I just want to comment that it's basically in contrast. It shouldn't have too much contrast. Yes.
That's right. It's confusing. Where you would want contrast is between the floor and the wall, because someone with low vision can't tell if that's a wall or the floor. So that's when you would use. That's right. Yeah. Put yellow sunglasses on and you'll see what your parents' vision is like, because the lenses of the eyes turn yellow. So they're actually changing the color of what they're actually seeing.
Yeah. So the opportunities, accessibility is good for business. We look at the numbers here. It says 40% of consumer spending, and there's $11.2 billion in the market over the next 5 years to look forward to. So it's an interesting point around making accessible environments beautiful. It's very possible. In fact, I'm working on a project right now, and my client is in the room where it's a lovely building. It's going to be all accessible, and it's a beautiful building right in the middle of downtown. So it's only 4 stories, but it's accessible. And so the landscape is all accessible. Of course, there's an elevator. But the point is that you make everything work, because anybody, whether they're on crutches or they need it for a stroller, they need accessibility. They're not just one type of person. So the opportunities are interesting for inclusive design. Well, I'll say that there's many layers. We'll say 3 layers of inclusive design. One is the broader beneficial impact. So the users and the systems and what they learn from using these new things for inclusive design. What about the process and tools? The tools that you need to develop for inclusive design, and then the diversity and uniqueness, because it's a one size fits one. You know, it's adapting to people who need things, and it's not just one size. Design allows for ease of maintenance, cleaning, repair to guarantee access year-round, not directly stated in the OPC or PSD, that's public spaces design. However, for design to be actually function, this must be included, facilities managers. So how many people have seen things like cones in the middle of mall hallways? I know it's to indicate wet, but when do they get picked up? Is it like 24 hours later? It is just, that's such a poor use of something that can be knocked over and moved into another space. What about something where there's a lot of snow in a parking lot, or window cleaning? So a lot of problems with maintenance and buildings today. It's interesting, now materials today are for buildings that could be cleaned without maintenance, and there's stuccos being done, things like that, which are really interesting. So I think we're going to see more of that biomimicry as an invention that makes sense for us, so we don't have to have these maintenance problems, and it costs a lot to maintain. The design of public spaces are integrating level changes seamlessly. This is a little area at Yonge and St. Clair, which has now incorporated 2 levels. One is this is a flat level, which is great for anybody who doesn't take stairs, and you've got a little bench to sit on. On the other side, you've got stairs to the bank. but it's still level on the other side of the bench. So human factors design, if true universal design is to occur for clients, facilities managers, project managers, architects, and designers, building owners need to work in tandem with ergonomists, human factors design experts. And you could describe this in detail.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how many of you are aware. So Prime Minister Trudeau set aside a number of millions of dollars for public consultations, because what's happening now is the province of Ontario, Manitoba, kind of BC, and also Nova Scotia have various forms and types of accessibility legislation. Ontario is the furthest ahead and is becoming quite piecemeal, and especially if you're working in companies that actually operate in each of the provinces. Do we use the Ontario Building Code in Ontario? What do we use in BC? Because the Vancouver Building Code's a bit better. Well, City of Mississauga has a really good building code that actually does provide access. So the public consultations have been completed. We provided a lot of information for BOMA made a submission as part of this. The consultation is now closed. They're now writing this up as a report summary, and then it will be presented as a bill through the federal parliament. And you can go to the website and actually see what's going. So this should get pushed through. So what that'll probably help from a business perspective is that we'll have more of like true universal design, but we'll have legislation very similar to Ontario's because of the fact that all businesses must be in compliance. Then that's most likely how it's going to be rolled out. So we'll start to see a national standard finally occur, which would be great.
Finally, contact information if you want to contact Jane and find out how training can be implemented for your company. I think this is the time to look at that. And thank you very much for joining us this morning. Does anyone have any questions?
Okay, so that's a good question from a manufacturing perspective, because going back those few slides, there's huge opportunities if you actually manufacture or make or sell products. The size of the market worldwide is the same size as the economic market through China. So everyone's falling over one another. We've got to get into the Chinese market. It's huge. So people with disabilities and the aging population represent billions and billions of dollars per year. So businesses that don't figure out that let's get in on that market, let's make products that actually are accessible, are missing a huge chunk of economic benefit. Probably your best place to go to is go to the City of London's design. What the City of London has decided, so municipalities are really very strictly regulated relative to accessibility. So if you go, you can actually, you don't have to purchase their design guidelines. I would start with that because they've taken it to universal design standards. Then if you manufacture to that specification, BIFMA, that's more furniture, et cetera, but there's some components of BIFMA and ANSI that actually talk about more universal design. The other thing, you can look at Australia and some European countries because they're way far ahead. Canada is actually we're way down relative to accessibility, despite the fact we have an aging population, which unfortunately means disability. We're very far behind. So contact me and I'll give you some other ideas, but City of London is a really good starting place for universal design. Yeah. So if you stick to more universal design concepts, you won't have to backtrack and try to change the designs. And the other part, I was at Fran's restaurant, and I always talk about the businesses that aren't accessible. So you'll see some of the risk associated with it. Fran's restaurant on Front Street, go into the washroom, and that grab bar, well, they had a great grab bar, but it's on the ground. It's fallen out of the wall. So that's the whole maintenance side. And is someone ever going into the washroom to check and make sure that it actually is accessible? Or do you have someone like myself or other people do hashtag access fail, Fran's restaurant? And often we'll get phone calls, but that's after the fact. So yeah, aim for the universal design. And that's what we did with Chrysler, et cetera, that you're trying to stay ahead of the curve so you don't have to try to re-engineer it. Yeah, that's important.
Anybody else?
So the other thing that you can think of, there was the one picture with and it had a hearing loop sign in that. So many people actually have very discreet hearing aids, but there's a little button on them. So if I see that there's a hearing loop and I'm going to interact with you, I'll switch that button and it'll actually give me more sound and it'll get rid of background sound. So in those sorts of counters, having a simple hearing loop, and these things are $300 to $500, they're portable, and you have a little sticker on it saying that we have a hearing loop. And again, then you have people in the disabled community saying, I'm going to give my business to these guys because they're actually making themselves accessible. Yeah, so that's another example, not just counter height. Yeah, it's easy to do business for everyone. And that's always the space versus, and the space per, per square foot and how much money it's worth. So there are ways to do that. It depends. If it's retail, it means that you're losing business. Yeah. And we know that it's $40 billion per annum in the province of Ontario itself, or over the next 5 years. So if retailers decide that the cost of a ramp is X, but you're missing this much in terms of revenue, then you need to make a decision. You won't get dinged unless there's a major renovation. There's nothing you can do, but you might have policies that if I have a customer and they can't get in, can we actually direct them to our online services and make sure that the online services are accessible? So you also try to find alternate solutions. Yeah.
I think just grading is very important. Yes. Grading to be as close to grade as you can. For example, Gianluca, you can talk to them about our project. Gianluca is a client of ours at the moment. We're building a small condominium, 4 stories, 8 units, yeah. But it's really good because it's very close to the ground, so we can put a ramp to it. But it's accessible all the way around, and it has to be all the way to the back of the condo, the whole building. You cannot not get to the rear because of fire. So if somebody's coming up from the rear, like I don't know if you have underground parking, but you might. Yeah, so you'll have to get up from the rear and then get to the front of the building. So that has to all be sloped. It can't be stepped. So the grading is probably the most important thing. Grading and drainage. I know they're not really pleasant subjects to think about, but they do matter. And right, Gianluca, you can talk to them about our project, how complicated it is for a small project, right?
My wife does have that.
That's good.
Perfect.
Yeah, good.
Excellent. Yeah.
That's good. Well, it sounds like you have a good project, and that's going to be in Midtown or something? Oh, nice, nice, very nice. I think the small building is a need because so many buildings are like so many stories, and they're very large, and nobody wants to live like that, not all people. So you do a smaller building, it's more boutique, a little bit, it's a smaller neighborhoodly feel. I think it's a very good building type.
That's part of it, but everyone goes to the wheelchair. Whenever we think disabled and then the little sticker, it's not. So people that are age 50 to 55 all probably have some change in your hearing, especially males in the room, you've lost the upper range of your hearing. So for those of you wives, make sure you lower your voices so you can be heard by your husbands, partners. So it's hearing loss. It's also change in vision. I was saying as people age, the lenses have your eyes yellow. So it might be the color that you're using, the contrast. It's right. So think of sensory changes as well. It's all those things, because people in wheelchairs, that's actually the smallest percentage of people with disabilities in Canada, but they're the most visible to us. So we always think wheelchair. So it's sensory. We lose some of our cognitive skills, our short-term memory changes. So for wayfinding and signage, I was under the pass system, I'm there every day, and now I can't remember where I'm supposed to go. So think of those things as well, so that buildings also are what's called aging in place. With age comes disability, so make sure that you're designing with that in mind. And that's where designers can be really helpful.
Yeah, and you should go to interior designer, by the way, for anything to do with color or space. I mean, I think there's some interior designers in this room. I believe you're sitting beside one. You know, professionals do bring something to every project.
Definitely.
And it's very important to go down that route initially for the first while, because that's your key thing. What's it going to cost? What's it going to look like? Yeah. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
I'll give you an example. So one of the major banks in Canada who must abide by federal legislation for accessibility, but also makes a point of hiring people with disabilities. Many of the banks do, TD, CIBC, RBC. They have a brand new building. This was about 4 years ago. We're there, we're helping people move in because of the ergonomic side of our business, making sure people with disabilities are comfortable. oh, okay, can you show me where the universal washroom is on the 6th floor? Because that's where Mr. X is going to be going. What? Remember, we told you he's in a mechanized wheelchair. We need to have the universal washroom. They go to the property manager and they say, oh, there's one on the ground level. He can go to the ground level. So for those of you that are old enough to remember down in the US where you had White's washroom and you had colored washrooms, and to a certain degree it still exists, you've now divided people into they or he can go downstairs. $250,000 later, they have a universal washroom on the 6th floor, because that's what the tenant required. It was mandatory and it was supposed to have been done and somehow got overlooked. So retrofits are hugely, and if you think of damage to the brand, if that got out, or if this individual decided, I'm going to human rights. Yeah. I need to be here on Monday morning to work just like everyone else, but I can't go to the washroom. So retrofits are, just talk to experts right up front and you'll save thousands and thousands. Yeah.
Well, there's generators for lifts. Right now, most elevators are computer driven, so that's one thing. And there's generators, for sure, backup generators are put into big buildings. They have to have them. Maybe small buildings as well. I think you're probably right. And maybe there's a design of that happening right now because small buildings need it, and the power outages just as yesterday. I don't know how many people were affected by that. Oh yes, quite a few. Thousands of homes because of the winds. Well,
oh yes, right, and knocking over lines. And there's a gentleman in a building that I did an assessment, and his manager wanted us to assess his accessibility as well. He's in a mechanized wheelchair. And he said, do you know that in the last year I've died 9 times? And what he meant is when they had emergencies and the alarm went off, they don't have a plan for him. So he sits upstairs while he waits. So 9 times that's happened. And again, it sends a message to you're a valued employee. We hired you, your skills are excellent. But in an emergency, not so much. So we have to be careful about the symbolism of it as well and what we're telling. And as Jason, one of our built environment auditors, says, who's in a wheelchair, you're temporarily abled. All of us in this room, we may have had an illness. You've seen a parent, but if we're blessed enough to live to be old enough, we're going to have disabilities. So this, even if it's a selfish incentive, let's make sure this stuff is designed universally so we can all use it.
Okay, are there any other questions? I think we're at our end of our session here. Thank you so much for coming. So please visit the show floor to see the exhibits and product demonstrations. The show floor will be open until 2 p.m. Enjoy a free luncheon and beverage courtesy of our show sponsors. Thank you. Enjoy the show. Thank you.